are in listen-only mode.
Well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining our Scrum Pulse today. This is our 7th Scrum Pulse, and we're going to hear from Eric Landis, who is in Indiana at the moment, also of Florida, and he's going to talk about enterprise DevOps, how to ship software with speed and confidence. My name is Mark Noneman. I'm a professional Scrum trainer with Scrum.org, as is Eric, and Scrum.org hosts the Scrum Pulse webinar that occurs about every month, sometimes 6 weeks or so. It is free. You can register and view the previously recorded webinars at the URL you see here, scrum.org/scrumpulse. And it's also on YouTube on the Scrum.org YouTube channel. In case you're not familiar with Scrum.org, Scrum.org has the mission to improve the profession of software development and really trying to increase the focus on empiricism, the use of empiricism to develop software and deliver value and improve business agility, and really trying to drive the continuous delivery of business value. And of course, Eric's topic today is right on target for that. But of course, by improving the profession of software development, we also have to build trust and respect between the business itself and the IT organization or the software development group. Let's go to the next slide. Now, for this webinar, your microphones have been muted. In fact, they're going to be muted throughout. So you can ask questions, and we definitely want you to do that. You can type them right into the question window on the GoToWebinar panel on your screen, and we will relay that to Eric when we get to the Q&A portion. Or you can tweet your question. Make sure that you tweet it to @scrum.org and use the hashtag ScrumPulse. And if you do that, we will again relay that to Eric during the Q&A period, which will occur near the end of the session at about 3/4 past the hour. So with that, let's get into the session. Eric Landis is here today, and Eric is a Scrum.org certified professional Scrum trainer. He's also a Microsoft ALM Most Valuable Professional, MVP. And he's experienced in working with small and large enterprise development organizations and also with individuals. Eric's been involved with the IT industry for over 20 years. He helps coach and implement Agile solutions and has presented Kanban, automated acceptance testing, and other Agile topics across the United States. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Eric. Here we go.
Hey, thanks very much, Mark, and very excited to go over this topic today and talk to folks about DevOps and specifically, how we can get to a DevOps culture using testable code. So really, this topic is about how testable code is going to lead you to DevOps opportunities. We're going to show you that. We're going to show you how it's essential for your continuous deployment automation. And testable code is going to help your team to deliver features with high value. So, of course, that really connects to a lot of the things that Mark was talking about, what Scrum.org stands for. So, so those are really the points I'm looking to push home on what you need with your testable code. So the agenda today, we're going to go over defining DevOps and its benefits. It's kind of a term that's really hot right now, so let's define and get on the same page as to what that means. And then we're going to talk about what's DevOps and testable code, what their dependencies are, and how you need to tackle that. Then we'll learn how you can prepare yourself and your team to write more testable code, and go over how you can master key practices in your team's day-to-day development so that will help you. And finally, learn how to measure testability when you're adopting those good testing principles in your DevOps transformation. And finally, we'll have a Q&A. So let's talk about what do we mean with DevOps? When we talk about Scrum, we talk about potentially shippable software, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail. So what does that mean? How is DevOps different? And quite honestly, I think it's more just a recognition of the fact that there's developers and there's operations. and the operations group of a lot of large IT organizations need to be brought into the Agile space, as it were. And so DevOps kind of recognizes that and gives us kind of a way to do that. So with operations meeting developers, the idea is let's make an Agile way to set up environments, keep them in conformity with applications. Let's make setting up environments like writing code, for instance, and let's set the stage for continuous delivery. Agile methods are going to allow you to deploy small sets of features quickly, so we shouldn't have these big boom deployments that occur every 2 years or whatever. Now we're talking about deploying maybe even multiple times a week, multiple times a day, depending on what kind of environment you're in. So we want to get to that organization, to that place in our organization. This is going to help your organization increase your speed to market and allow organizations to make database decisions on features. So when we get to DevOps, we want to deliver features quickly, and then in the end, we also want the ability to analyze what users are working on and make our features that we're working on relevant to the customer, use what they want. So, one of the reasons I think DevOps is crucial, I was working at a customer a while back, and this customer took over 4 weeks after and this was a Scrum team, we had been sprinting continuously and doing well for what we thought was well for at least 10 sprints. At the end of those 10 sprints, we were ready to deploy to production, and we had to include a hardening sprint, which there's no such thing in Scrum, right? A hardening sprint, but we included it nonetheless, and quite honestly, that's a term I but it was used. And that hardening sprint, we all, jumped on defects, triaged them, and made changes, and we were able to deploy. Then we deployed to production, which took another 2 weeks, and as soon as we had deployed that application out to the wild, there were 2 defects that were mission critical that needed to be fixed right away. Now, if we had a continuous delivery DevOps kind of culture, that wouldn't have been such a difficult issue, but now we have these fixes we have to deploy, and we really don't have 2 to 4 weeks to get them out to production. That's the kind of issue that we're looking to solve when we talk about DevOps and specifically continuous delivery. So how do we get there? How does your team get there, right? So also when we're talking about DevOps, as I mentioned, as a Scrum team, and I assume most folks are using Scrum. You might be using some other Agile methods, but by and large, most teams I've worked with are using Scrum. And the Scrum teams have that assumption of potentially shippable software at the end of every sprint. So what do you mean by that? So you need to think about that. If it's really shippable, let's have a process so that I could actually ship that at the end of every sprint. Or let's think of this. Could I actually, when I say that a feature or a user story is complete, and as a product owner I say I approve that, I'm ready for that feature to be done, could I actually click a button and have that deployed to production? That would be kind of cool. So those are the kinds of things that we might think about when we talk about that potentially shippable phrase. The idea is, if we do this, we have a repeatable process so we don't have surprises when deploying to production. So a DevOps team really needs to have lots of automation to help them repeat the process and not have to rely on manual steps when they deploy. So let's look at this graphic here, kind of coming from Microsoft. This kind of, when they're talking about DevOps, this is the graphic they refer to, and I like to refer to, so we plan, and it's really the life cycle of Scrum in a lot of ways, right? But we're being very explicit about what we're doing here. So we plan, so we're using Scrum, we're building backlog. In development, we're sprinting right here, and we develop and test, and we might even be, this all might be within a sprint, right? So then we are going to go to a release, and from that release, we're going to monitor and learn. So we talked about that. We'll really be focusing more on this part right here. We got to get this right, develop and test, before we can get to these cool things, releasing and monitoring and learn. One of the things I know, we want to get to that repeatable process. Worked with a company where they had to, when they had to do deployments, we had to do full manual steps, and we would deliver documents that were, 10 pages long, showing teams, the infrastructure folks, how to deploy once we went to a staging environment. So the problem with that process is it's very error prone, lots of variability there, depending on who is doing the deployments, if they haven't done it before. And because of that, it's not a very repeatable process. So what we want to do is take that big stack of manual steps and turn that into pushing a button and deploying that out there. So why am I saying we need testable code? Let's think about that process, why testable code is first step, right? So if we want to do continuous delivery, we need to automate. And when I say testable code, I'm talking about creating code that we can test through automation. So that might be unit tests. It might be automated testing via something like Selenium for your UIs, whatever. But those particular tools, whatever tools you use, is not the point. The point is I'm using some tools that help me automate my tests, and I'm thinking about testability in the beginning of my development rather than at the end or as an afterthought. So if I'm thinking and I'm creating code that is testable, then what that allows me to do is run tests when I'm doing my continuous integration or continuous delivery builds, and that's important, right? So if I'm doing a continuous integration build, I want to be able to merge my code, make sure it compiles, and then I also want to run hopefully some unit tests that test that the code is what, myself as a developer, I wanted the code to do. And then maybe even run some other tests that are maybe UI tests if I deploy to an environment, or some kind of integrated testing that tests across the units and not just at that small unit value. So that's why I want to create testable code, is because then I can automate that in my builds. So then I have a nice level of confidence in my builds, and when I go to deployment, I can get my operations group to have a little bit more trust in what I'm delivering, in that, so that they believe that the code is not error prone. So in that story I told you earlier where we delivered defects into production, we want to eliminate that. We don't want to deliver that. I mean, obviously people don't want to deliver defects into production, and this method will help you reduce the risk of doing that. So as I said, continuous deployment or continuous delivery, we need quality to do that. And why do we need quality? First off, we want to build trust with our operations folks as we're creating a release pipeline. We want some level of trust that, hey, these folks have tested the code, and as we deliver, the problems in the delivery are more around configuration, and they're not actual code problems. If we're delivering code that hasn't been tested thoroughly and doesn't have this automated testing around it to give you a good set of quality measures, then you're going to lose that trust of the operations group, and more importantly, things are going to escape out into the wild, and that's what we want to eliminate. So while I'm saying testable code means utilizing automation, so I'm not saying that you're going to eliminate manual testing. Hopefully what we're going to do is eliminate a lot of the manual rote steps that happen in your testing and give more exploratory testing, which again will give you higher quality as a team. But the testable code that is automated, if we're writing testable code, now we've got this automation. Now we can build that into our process, build it into our release pipeline, and help the team to release more frequently and be comfortable with releasing to multiple environments. So I can't have that this build works on my machine mentality that a lot of times you'll hear from developers. We want to get away from that. We want to think, hey, this build works anyway, and anywhere I put it because I just deployed it to this environment, it works fine. So that's really where we want to get. So testable code, what does that mean? What does that mean to you and your team? So the first thing is, you need to have disciplined teams. And so I think Scrum really encourages discipline in the framework that it puts around your team. So we give you sprints, right? So my team can plan how to do the work, and my team can also plan what's the best way to get things done. So hopefully this means you're telling the team we're writing code at that small level. Maybe we're following practices like solid principles, hopefully. And when we do that, that really helps push that testable code. So if we're doing that, we're going to write unit tests, and maybe we're even doing unit tests, hopefully doing that with test-driven development or test-driven design methods. And when we do that, that's going to help us measure our tests. So if we use test-first type principles, we're going to utilize the metrics, and we'll get into that a little bit later, that will help our team understand how well we're doing with tests. So maybe a disciplined team, our definition of done might include, so in our Scrum team, at the beginning, we're going to create a definition of done that says when the story's done, I need to have unit tests around my code, and I'm ensuring you that we're going to have, let's say, 70% code coverage on the project, something like that. So those are kinds of metrics, and we'll talk about what they mean in a little bit, but having those kinds of discussions and issues in your definition of done will help your team's confidence. It will give external stakeholders outside the team some confidence and transparency around what we're doing, what we're delivering, and it really will help your team to get to that, to testable code and really to the continuous delivery. Now, when I mentioned solid principles, what does that mean? If you're not familiar, real quickly, solid is a concept a lot of folks like Uncle Bob Martin and others around software craftsmanship would highly recommend, and I'm sure, and we do as well, and that is single responsibility principle, that's the S, open-close principle, the Liskov substitution principle, interface segregation principle, and the dependency inversion principle. So all these, the acronym SOLID really focuses your team towards developing software in a very safe way as far as writing code that can be testable. So again, this principle is a good thing to start with your team to make sure your code, and let's do code reviews following, are we using solid principles? So I talked a little bit about metrics. I'm going to show you what a couple of those might be. Now I'm using Visual Studio is an example. I'm a C# coder mainly, and so using Visual Studio, there's a lot of opportunities. Whatever IDE you're using, you should be able to find these kind of code metrics in many different ways. So, for instance, at the bottom here, showing you my sample, here are my code coverage results. Look at me, I've got 3 whole tests that I've run. So it doesn't look like I'm writing some soup testable code, but I am, because I'm doing test-driven development. So I just started this application. And if we look down here at the code coverage results, I'm going to expand that a little. Code coverage results tell us how much of the specific code is covered by tests and how much is not. And so when you hear code coverage as a metric, keep in mind that that is telling you how many tests are written and how much of your code is covered by tests. It's not actually telling you that these are good tests or anything. That really comes through code reviews. But it does help remind teams that you do need to write tests around your code. So that's probably the biggest beauty I see in code coverage. So you want to regularly review code coverage with your team. I would put that in your definition of done as, hey, we're going to do X amount of code coverage for this project, and with the caveat, code coverage is just about tests for my team. I specifically recommend them as unit tests, so what the team, what developers care about. So my unit tests just mean my tests are passing what I want them to pass. I'm not doing integration testing. I'm not doing acceptance testing with these unit tests. They're testing really for that development, the development team. Now, if I want to do integration testing, I might do some other metrics around that. Now, another code metric that's very good to have is, and this comes out of the box in Visual Studio, are a maintainability index. So that's that kind of shows you code maintenance and has some metrics around it. A really good one, I think, is cyclomatic complexity. And cyclomatic complexity really kind of measures the different pathways your code is taking through all the source code and how complex is it. We want to keep that number low. So these are good metrics to use when you want to do things like code coverage. Again, the idea is to get that code to where it's maintainable and it creates good opportunity for testing. And again, these are at the code level. When we talk about testing at the user interface level, it's maybe a little different. But these metrics help you get that base so that changing code is a little easier because I have a lot of unit tests around it, and my maintainability is a lot easier. So again, use metrics with caution, of course. We really want to use these as learning tools, not as disciplinary tools. So I would caution you with that. So getting to testable code, let's talk about some ceremonies that I would use as kind of the term I would talk about it. These are not anything that is prescribed by any framework, really. There might be some other frameworks, but certainly not in Scrum are they prescribed. We do talk about generalizing specialists within a team, and most likely that's what's going to happen with your team. So we're going to have people who test and people who code, but we most likely will have people who test also doing something else. Maybe they're helping to write stories, maybe they're helping the product owner prioritize or write acceptance tests, those kinds of things, and then they're helping run tests and testing. And maybe even doing some coding by writing test automation. At the same token, developers or coders are coding, but maybe they're doing something else. Maybe they're helping test. We want to probably don't want them testing the story they just wrote, but maybe they're helping on another story, or again, helping on some of those other things, maybe on the UI side or whatever. But the idea is our team members are not just doing one thing. Hopefully they're doing different things, whatever's necessary to complete this. And so generalizing skills can be helpful in a lot of ways. For one thing, we have code reviews. This is another ceremony I would do. Code reviews are going to help you learn, right? So these aren't code reviews just between individuals. The code reviews I recommend are with the team, with the point of learning. And in the case of testable code, this is where a code review would be very helpful. As you walk through, you look at cyclomatic complexity, or we look at code coverage. As a team, you can point out here in this particular section of code is where you would write a test, and here's how we might write a test. We also might look at tests that are written and analyze how they might be written better. Again, these code reviews are ceremonies that can be used. They shouldn't take more than an hour a sprint, but again, it's for the team to learn and to get better. So you might want to do that as part of your, maybe before or after the retrospective, a time that works for you. It'd be a good time to do these code reviews. Another, I call it a ceremony. It's not really a huge time sink, but it's called test case creation, and we've used this with great success. It's a session with coders and testers. Now, obviously, we should be collaborating and talking together, but this is an intentional time that we get together when we begin working on a story, and the two team members, or however many team members who are working on the story, get together as a tester and a coder and basically talk about, hey, here's what I'm going to test, here's the test I'm creating, and as a coder, I now know what is going to be tested, so there's no surprises at the end when a tester comes and says, hey, you didn't do this, this failed in the test. Also, we would talk about, what's automated and what's not, hopefully a lot of automation. So these are, they shouldn't take more than 15, 20 minutes to just sit down and go over them, and really it's about feedback between the two. Obviously, we hope you're co-located and you're always having feedback, but again, this is an intentional session just to get you started out on your story, thinking about testing. Another way to really ensure that you have testable code, is to have small product backlog items or user stories that can make your code more testable. So, if you know the INVEST acronym, that really speaks well to this. I would look that up. It's basically talking about making your stories testable and really smaller. And so, obviously, depending on your team, small may mean something different if we're talking about level of effort. But the idea is I can get that done in a short amount of time. So that's going to most likely make this testable. It's not it's not set in stone that that's true, but most likely this is going to be one thing that will really help you get to that testable code. So how are we going to prepare our team to get there, right? So I've been doing this, and my team wants to learn how to do testable code. How do we do that? So we want them to learn test-driven design. I think on here I actually have test-drive design. I mean test-driven design. So this is going to help you care about writing tests before writing code, and as we said before, write smaller stories. So one thing I would encourage to help your team learn to be better at test-driven development or test-driven design is to use something called the coding kata. And we'll talk about this a little bit more, but coding kata is a way to exercise your team's ability or practice your team's ability to write code, and it's a great way to get better at writing code. It's going to take a little bit of time from the team. Maybe that means at the end of the day we would do a coding kata after work, or maybe that's part of our workday, however you work it out. And I'll give you some strategies here near the end of this as to how you might implement a coding kata. The idea here with the coding kata is have somebody who's an expert on your team come in and actually write TDD and do a test-driven design session that people can see, and do this a few times. Don't do it just once, and that can really help you out. The other thing is you might want to have, if your testers aren't writing automated unit tests, UI tests, this is not test-driven design, but you might want to have them write UI tests with expertise if you haven't done that before. So, if you're using Selenium or some other tool like that, bring somebody in, help them write those automated UI tests so that you can introduce that into your process. Again, I would recommend test case creation sessions, understanding that before. And as I said here, I'm just a huge fan of writing the right size stories, smaller stories. As small as we can get them, that's going to help your teams deliver with high confidence and high quality. So once we're starting that journey and we've decided we want to do this, let's talk about how do we continue to get better at having these automated tests. So we certainly want to come up with good metrics. So if the goal here is we want to get into DevOps, we want to write these tests so that we can continuously deliver, let's think about what are good metrics along with this. If you look at this graph right here, let's see if I can point to it. There we go. This graph is actually quite meaningless. I just put it on there to say, hey, you should have a graph. But what the idea is, you need to come up with a graph that makes sense for what you're trying to do. So what does that mean? Does it mean we're going to measure defects against releases? Are we going to measure our tests that fail, right? So you need to come up with those good metrics as a team, and I would recommend starting with metrics that are already available to you. Some of those I showed. We want to use code coverage. We want to use your cyclomatic complexity or some of those code analysis techniques that are available to you, and then let's build on those. Let's look at defects that are getting generated after we push to production. That's something certainly you want to analyze no matter what, but let's look at that. Let's measure any defects that are coming back continually, because that's obviously a similar defect that comes back after we deploy every time would be a sign there's a problem that we need to fix, and we need to come up with something maybe that's in a retrospective to fix that. But let's write some metrics that will help us capture that. Let's also say that tests that fail mean the code's not ready for production. So this means if we're writing automated tests and we're putting them in our builds, in our deployment release pipeline, then when a test fails, that means that build fails. So let's make sure we're doing that and put that in there. So another great way to make sure that you prepare your team for the testable code is to make sure they understand the acceptance criteria, and that's where one-on-one sessions or whatever are going to be helpful as they're going in and starting to code. We want them to understand the acceptance criteria and kind of write their code to that. And finally, we want them to have a well-understood definition of done. So I kind of am harping on this, but let's make sure we understand what's in there. If we're putting code coverage in there, what does that mean? Is it code coverage? Are we talking about code coverage to different DLLs? Is it the whole application? What does code coverage mean to you? Or is it one particular part of your application? Is it the whole application? Let's understand what that means, and let's be consistent. So this is how we can prepare them. We're going to collaborate, implement things like make sure failing tests don't move up the chain. Now let's talk about some key practices you can use and you can master to do that, right? So for instance, coding katas. So you can practice test-driven development and writing tests. So I'm a big fan of these. Uncle Bob Martin talks about them. I think it's the pragmatic programmer. I think that's the name. He has a lot of katas out there. So what exactly is a coding kata? So if you're not familiar, the idea comes from martial arts. So the idea is in martial arts, right? We go to our dojo and we practice what we're going to do so that when we actually do it, it's just muscle memory happening. And so that's what the coding kata is kind of about is, hey, let's just make something like test-driven development muscle memory. So the way a coding kata might work, and we do this actually at AgileThought, is we'll have some coding katas, and the idea is we get together, we decide on an exercise, and we time box it to maybe a half hour, maybe 45 minutes, and during that time, the idea is to get better. Maybe this is to learn a new language in our instance, but if you're there to learn test-driven development, the idea is we're going to write this exercise writing tests first. So one of the ones I like to use is called the bowling game, and it's all about creating a scoring system for the game bowling, right? And so I kind of understand the rules around bowling very well, so it's pretty easy to code that, or at least understand what I need to code. And then the idea is we start out with a test. We're going to roll, for instance, in bowling kata, we roll 1, and the score should be 1. So I write a unit test, make it fail. Then I start writing code around that to make it pass. And then we do the next test. And the next test is, if we roll 2, and then that should equal 2. And then what if we do a spare, and so on. So we're writing unit tests, and we are passing, and then we're failing, and then we're writing code to let it pass, and this gives you that rhythm that you're supposed to have with that test-driven development, or test-driven design, as a lot of people might call it. So coding katas, you don't have to do the bowling game. There's another one, prime factors. There's other places out there that have, lots of really complex, I think there's game of life is one, a lot of complex scenarios you can use for this to keep it fresh. So how would you implement that with your team? So I was with a team that did coding katas and actually had the entire team do this. Now they were doing it every morning for a half hour when they started out. And that team, it was testers, developers would get together, run through the kata, and the funny thing is at the end of each kata we would destroy the project we were working on, so you never went back to it. So the idea was get better, getting into muscle memory, but we're not using this for anything. So that's one way of doing it. You might want to do this less time, but it really depends on how quickly and up to speed you want folks to be. But as I said, big fan of coding katas, really great way to get your team started on using testable, writing testable code. So another key practice I would say for testable code is a collaborative, no-holds-barred code review. So I mentioned this earlier, it's a learning experience, and we want to learn the best practices that we have for our team. So what we do with the code review, we get the whole team together. Like I said earlier, maybe it's at the end of the sprint. We bring up some code, and normally what I would do is run either this Visual Studio's code analysis, or I might do something a little more complex, use a tool like End-Depend, and use that to give me some of that data where I can look at the code that maybe has too high of a cyclomatic complexity, or is too high maintainability, maybe has a lot of lines of code, something more than what we're aiming for. But again, if we're looking for testable code, we're going to look for those metrics that make sense, and then we're going to dig into them. You know, maybe it's we look at our code coverage and we see that some certain sections are not covered. Hey, let's go over that code and see why it's not covered. Really, it's up to you, but the idea is go in there with a mission of what you want to cover, and be pretty, I don't want to say brutal, but be honest for sure about the code. Let's ask the team, hey, so why are you coding it this way? There may be a very legitimate reason for that. It may make it more complex to test against, so let's find out why that's happening, and let's try and mitigate that. And actually, you're going to get some action items for your retro probably out of these code reviews. So again, they're no holds barred. You know, a lot of them I've been to can feel kind of brutal if you're the developer whose code's going through. So have a thick skin. Hopefully the team can have a thick skin, but the idea is not to beat down people. It's to learn about why the code is done that way. So go in there. You know, we're talking about the team ownership of code a lot of times, so take that attitude, right? Don't think of it as your code when you're being reviewed, but think of it as it's a team's code, and let's make it better. And finally, another key practice we want to master is let's work together, testers and coders, understanding correct tests for the requirements they're working on, and this would be that test case creation session. So again, I would recommend that if you're just make sure it's understood at the beginning in your planning session. So we're doing sprint planning, and we're planning out each story. You know, just understand at the beginning of each story or each product backlog item, we're going to have some time where the tester and coder, person who's testing, person who's going to code it, sit together, or if you're doing pair programming, you know, the three of you sit together, maybe product owner is present, and we determine our plan for how we're going to test this, and we get fairly specific so that everybody understands that. It's a good time to have the product owner present, just because, again, more communication. The tester talks about, this is what I'm testing, and that may not be what the product owner was thinking, so always a good time to get some feedback from the product owner on what they were thinking. So the test case creation sessions, I really like those. Make them lightweight and quick. You don't want to do a whole bunch at the same time. You want to do them one at a time if you can. So testability metrics, what they're for, the good of metrics that you're going to use. Let's use them to learn. Let's use them to refine what we're doing. We don't want to measure things individually, right? You know, testability metrics are really for your team to get better, to make sure we're writing testable code. They're not there to, you know, slap people on the hands or whatever. But there are different ways to do that. This is all, again, about your team, your Scrum team, and specifically your development team. You know, we certainly don't want people to game the metrics, so let's do what we can to make sure they're not gamed. You know, sometimes, you know, usually when it's all about the team, there's less likelihood that people want to game the metrics. So as mentioned before, here's some metrics that I've found successful in the past. These are reports you might want to look at. Code coverage, again, code coverage doesn't tell you have good unit tests. It just tells you we're testing things. So make sure those, you know, you have that in mind as you look at your code coverage, but it does tell you that we're writing unit tests. So that's a good thing. You want to, in the code coverage, let's look at that over time, all right? Is it the same? Is it getting better or worse? And maybe we don't care because it's only a few percentage points worse, and there's some reasons for that. But we do want to keep it consistent. And is that tracking what we thought would happen? And build quality reports and defect reports are going to give you a great idea of how things are going. Are defects getting out to different environments outside of our development environment? So defect reports, I would be measuring defects outside of sprints, right? So if I get a defect for a story within a sprint, to me that's part of the story being done. You know, or my story's not done until all the defects are complete. So I wouldn't count that, but outside of a sprint, I would certainly count that, and I think we have some different opinions from other folks, but outside of a sprint, once it gets outside of a sprint, I want to understand how a defect got outside of a done story. So we want to track that in our defect reports. So feature test metrics that you might want to have are feature usage reports and set-based testing, and that really gets to a little bit beyond this when we're doing continuous deployment and we're able to get some metrics from like production, et cetera, on what people are using. And set-based testing, that's where you might be able to get, especially if you have a good testing, automated testing setup. Now I can release kind of quick features and see, hey, is my user using that feature? If not, maybe we don't invest more in that feature. So, or maybe we can do some quick creation of a feature and not fully done, and then we don't invest at all in a feature if people aren't using it. So you have those kinds of opportunities once you can do continuous delivery and have some good testing strategies around that. So finally, as I said, you have this testable code. Now you're going to bring that trust to operations. They're going to trust that when your code gets released, it is high quality, and I don't have to blame the operations folks that it's a configuration error when it was actually a coding error, which is a lot of times what I see with the finger pointing between the two different departments in different enterprises. So operations will receive lots of benefits, not the least of which is a quicker release path. I don't have to spend 2 hours deploying something and finding out you wrote it down incorrectly. It's basically push of a button. We feel comfortable about the quality, and now we're measuring things out in operations. So operations gets to do a little bit more of the fun stuff and not worrying so much about the problem. So there's definitely some benefits there. So really just in summary, want to go over what we really talked about today. We talked about how testable code's helping you begin that drive to the DevOps culture. It's a journey, that's a lot of times what we say, and it is a journey, and I think it's kind of fun. But let's begin by writing testable code, and hopefully you're convinced we need to start there. So if you want to start there, let's prepare your team with habits like using solid principles. Let's master things like test-driven development and test case creation. Use those code reviews to help your team learn. And we want to measure progress in a healthy way, and we want to use those good metrics that work for your organization. Once you do that, now we're ready to start looking at how we can continuously deliver our product in the right manner for our organization. So thank you. That's basically my talk, and I'll turn this over to Mark, see if we have any questions or anything, and go to the Q&A.
Thanks, Eric. And just as a reminder, in fact, if you could pop up the next slide for me, you can write your questions into the question window. We already have quite a few. Or you can tweet them to @Scrum.org and make sure you use the hashtag ScrumPulse. So Eric, yeah, lots of questions here. We'll get to as many as we can in the next 10 or 11 minutes, but we won't probably cover them all. say my experience is that when I go into clients, well, I think I can safely say all of them that I visit anyway, have a lot of existing manual tests for the product that they have right now. And in adopting Agile practices, they often are struggling with, how do I get started with automated tests? What do you recommend that where should people start?
Right. Oh, great question. So we have a lot of manual tests. I get that. So let's assume we're doing no test automation. I would start, depending on your organization, you could start two-pronged way, but certainly I would start with the developers doing some automated unit tests. And so that's not going to come from your manual tests. That's going to come from, when I begin writing code for my next feature, or if I'm fixing something, I'm going to write a unit test. Another great practice is, if we have a defect, let's write a test around that defect, and let's write an automated test around that defect. Now, that can go, the defect strategy can also be used if I'm doing, let's say, UI tests using something like Selenium or any of the other tools out there. And I would take that, estimate how long it's going to take to write an automated unit test, and now I'm starting to build a backlog of some nice unit tests so that I have some of that structure. You're not going to get there right away. Another book I would recommend, I think it's called, it's by Michael Feathers, Legacy, writing unit tests for legacy systems, I think is the name of it. I probably butchered that name, but if you look up Michael Feathers, and he'll have a book on legacy systems. That's the book. It's really a great one on getting started. But hopefully those are some good points there that'll help you get started.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Eric. Yeah, I think getting started with unit tests and defect tests in a TDD fashion is certainly a great way to start. And I think the other thing I often recommend is just do a little bit at a time. Every sprint, if you could automate 1 or 2 tests, it doesn't seem like much when you get started, but over time, that constant pressure makes a difference.
Yeah, totally agree, Mark. That's a great point.
Cool. Hey, another question from Jason. Jason asked, have you found a way to run test case creation sessions concerning UI components that haven't been built yet?
Well, yeah, so I'm assuming, so I kind of assume that what we're talking about hasn't been built yet. And so the way I normally do that is we will have wireframes or some kind of mock-up that show us what the UI should look like, and that's where the test case creation would happen. And certainly we want to slice that narrowly, what we're doing. So you might end up doing some UI stuff that's delivering a fraction of the value from a whole page. So let's say we're working on a web page, and you've got a nice, beautiful design of your web page, and there's a form on there and some other nice stuff, and I would separate that out. So we've got our form, our navigation, and the testing, the stories. This is where you split your stories small, and then we should be able to do a test case creation on the navigation or on the form, and that's the way I would split that up. Mark, you got any suggestions you might have?
No, I think that's my same experience. You do have to start with at least a good idea of what you're trying to achieve. Maybe there's an existing wireframe, but at least you've had those initial conversations to begin refining the features that'll be part of that UI. So yeah, I think that's about right. Great. Now there's also a question around test coverage, because we talked quite a bit about that. Could you say a little bit about the difference between regular code coverage, the simplest metric, versus, say, functional coverage or branch coverage, the different kinds of coverages that are available? How might you use those, and what are the pros and cons of those?
Sure. So, I'll be honest. I don't use a lot of I don't use branch coverage. Functional coverage, if you're doing test automation. So if I'm if I'm doing test automation at the UI level and I'm doing unit testing, I'm going to make sure I have some way to categorize those. So when I run code coverage results, I can do that on, say, functional testing, right, or on just standard unit testing. So, and then on functional testing, I'm really more concerned about pathways, and touching that. So I would look at the code coverage with that in mind. Is this test going across? How many paths is it going across? And I wouldn't look at that. Well, let me go back. I would be I would handle the functional coverage a little differently because UI testing tends to happen a little bit later in life when things get a little bit more solid on the UI side. So in the first 2 or 3 sprints of a brand new project, for instance, UI testing is a little problematic. So, but once we get things stabilized and we get that first UI stabilized, then we can go to town with our UI testing, and then I start really looking at that functional coverage. As opposed to maybe the first 2 sprints, I might not worry so much about it, but I will. Those first 2 sprints, I will be I'll be keeping a close eye on the unit tested coverage because I want that. I want to make sure that stays at a consistent rate.
Good. Okay, cool.
How about you, Mark? You have experience with that?
Well, I think that my experience is that any coverage measurement is better than none, so that's the first statement I would make. And if you don't know what your coverage is at all, then you should at least start. And I would just start with the basic coverage. It's true that functional coverage and more advanced coverage like branch coverage might become useful, particularly if you have a lot of legacy code where you've got a lot of manual tests and you have no idea what your challenges are. But I would only use that in conjunction with something like cyclometric complexity, so that if you had a particularly complex area of code, you'd probably want to dive down into branch coverage and things of that nature. So I'd keep it simple, and if you don't have any coverage knowledge, start with something. That would be my guidance.
Yeah, I would concur.
All right, well, there's another question here. That question, by the way, was from Syed. Thank you, Syed, for that question. There was a question here also. We've talked about continuous deployment, and we also hear the term continuous delivery, getting back to that whole DevOps theme. Could you say a little bit about the difference between continuous deployment and continuous delivery?
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, they're really pretty synonymous. I mean, continuous delivery is really the industry term that I am thinking about, because continuous delivery really speaks to we are delivering to really to production, right? So we're delivering out to where it matters. Now, continuous deployment just means I'm automatically deploying to some environment somewhere. But continuous delivery is probably the highest for me, from my perspective. That's where I want to get, right? If I'm in the DevOps culture, that one of the things I'm doing is continuous delivery. That's probably one of the main things I'm doing. And continuous deployment probably helps me get there because I'm automating environments before that, but I'm getting a release pipeline that takes me all the way to production in continuous delivery.
Okay, good.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think the difference is a little bit subtle, but the difference probably between do people install software locally, or is it more of a software as a service? That can often be a bit of a subtle difference there. Let's see. In terms of, you talked a bit about the practices, the katas, code katas. I certainly like those. Are there any? I enjoy them myself, and I like the companies that make that part of the daily work. Just like on sports teams, it's not enough to just play the game. You have to practice. Are there any downsides to katas, do you think?
The only thing is the biggest downside would be if I am continually doing the same exercise, it's going to get stale. I'm not going to learn maybe how to handle a different problem. So make sure you mix up your exercises so that it's all about memory muscle. So I certainly want to do something long enough so that I understand, I'm doing tests first. So if I'm doing a coding kata for tests first, I want to make sure that is the learned behavior. But then I also want to make sure that happens on every new project. So I probably am going to mix up the different exercises. Otherwise, I can do bowling game kata in my sleep, right? I mean, which is a good thing in some ways, but maybe I need to learn how to handle, some different kind of logic in my code somewhere a different way.
Good.
Just like anything, we want to mix it up, right?
Yeah. And as you mentioned, the pragmatic programmer at that website, you can find all kinds of coding katas, not only the Bowley scoring and the prime factors, but several others as well. And they're all good, and mixing them up probably helps stretch your experience.
Yep, exactly.
We're out of time, Eric. Thank you so much for your efforts here in the webinar and your explanation. Could you go to the last slide, please? I want to remind everyone that the Scrum Pulse occurs about every month or so. We're going to have another one in October and also in November. So we have a couple more coming through the end of this year. And it's on a wide variety of topics. Of course, you can go to Scrum.org/ScrumPulse and see the previously recorded Scrum Pulse webinars. And I want to thank all of you in the audience for attendance. And again, Eric, thank you so much for your time and presenting to us on testable code and continuous delivery in DevOps. Thanks everyone.
Mark, and I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Bye-bye.